So we'll begin this lesson by creating the HTML for our form. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because most of these things you should be familiar with, but I will point out any of the new HTML5 form parameters that are available, and also I'll give you recommendations on how I believe you should set up a form. So on the page that we're going to be working from, we will be inserting the form right after this paragraph right here that just says, please use the contact form below or telephone us to get in touch with any questions. So the form is going to go inside of the article tag, and the article tag you can see is wrapping around this. So I'm going to go ahead and just create some space here, and I will place an HTML comment on my page, just so I can easily identify the area in my HTML where the form is going to begin and end. That's not necessary, but I just find it to be helpful. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to create the form tag. So the form tag is going to have several attributes. Some of them are optional and some of them are things that you are going to have. One of the things that's optional is an ID, but you'll commonly find that a form has a ID assigned to it, and that's just so that you can go ahead and identify this form uniquely and to be able to control it with JavaScript and things like that. So I'm going to give my form an ID of contact form. I'm going to give the form a class of contact questions, and I'm going to put the action tag. In this particular exercise, we're not going to be placing anything in the action tag. The action tag is going to take the value of where the form is going to get parsed. You can put an email address if you just want the form to be emailed. That, of course, is not a secure method of getting the form information. It's recommended that you use some other scripting language to be able to take in the form. I commonly use PHP, but that is beyond the scope of this class, so I am just going to leave a null hashtag in the value field for now. And I'm going to go ahead and assign the method to be post. Then I'm going to close my form tag, and of course the form tag comes with a closing form tag, so all of the form elements are going to wrap around the form itself. Now the next form element that I'm going to insert onto my page is going to be a field set. Field sets are optional, but they are recommended. They help to make your form become more accessible to your end user, so I generally like to use them. And I'm going to assign a ID for my field set called Get in Touch, and in addition to that I'm going to be using the title tag, and again this is just to help accessibility of the form. So if someone views my form and they are unable to see the elements, this will help them to understand what all of the elements mean within the form. Inside the field set we're going to create a legend, and the legend is going to contain the actual text that we want to display, and this section of the form is going to say Get in Touch. When I build forms, I like to build them within a list, and this is just going to help to be able to keep my form a little bit more organized. So again, I'm just going to wrap an ordered list around the form elements, and we will style these so that they are not going to be visible with CSS later on, but I am going to use the ordered list to be able to contain the form elements. The next thing that I'll do is I'll add a list item, and the list item is going to contain both the label and the input tag for my form. So I'll begin by creating a label tag, and when you utilize label tags in your forms, you have a couple of different options on how you can apply them to the form. You can either wrap the label tag around the form element and the input tag, or you can utilize the label with a for attribute, and the for attribute is going to be able to associate that particular label with the particular input tag. Both methods are going to have their own pros and cons. For this exercise, I'm going to be using the for method. So I'm going to create my label, I'm going to assign it a for value, and I'll show you how that works with the input tag in just a second. I'm going to put the text that I want to appear on the screen, and then I'm going to close the label tag. Immediately following the label tag, I'm going to create the input tag, and I'm going to use the type attribute to set the type, and this particular input tag is just going to be a text type. I'm going to give it a name value, and the name value is going to match the value that I've assigned in my for tag. That will go ahead and create the relationship between these two elements. I'm also going to assign an ID here, and the ID is going to also use the name value. I'll add a title tag for usability. I'm going to set autofocus, and the autofocus is a Boolean attribute. It is something that is new inside of HTML5, and when you assign this to a tag, it just specifies that this particular input tag should immediately get focus when the page loads. So this is going to be the first tag that's going to appear on our page, and we're going to have the focus appear there. Then I'm going to use the placeholder attribute, and the placeholder attribute is going to allow me to place some text inside of the form element, some placeholder text. And this is a great method that you can give your users some sort of feedback on what sort of information you're expecting for them to place inside your form field. This is really helpful, especially when you're designing a form for smaller screens, because the placeholder text can utilize some of the real estate that's already being used on your page and let the user know how you expect to place the information. So you can see here I'm requesting their last name, comma, first name. This is giving feedback on how they should place that information. And then I've also specified that this field is a required field, and this is an HTML5 attribute as well. And the HTML5 attribute, it's not necessary to apply the values to all of them. So if they are placed inside the input tag, then they are true, and if they're not there, then they would be false. So that's true with autofocus and required. And now that I've finished that, my list item closes, and then I'll go on and create the next form element. So we'll just create a couple of form elements here. I'm going to create another list item. This is going to be for my next form element, and I'll just copy the text that I already have for my form so that I can get through this a little bit quicker. The next thing that I'm going to ask for is going to be email, and this also is going to be required, so I'll leave the little asterisk there so the user knows that it's required. I'm going to change the type to email. In HTML5, there's many different types that you can assign, and when you assign a type, then when the page loads, it is going to utilize that type so that the browser will know that you're expecting an email type of entry. So it's going to be looking for the @ symbol and the last part of the domain. It's looking for the text to appear in that way. It's not going to verify that the email is a valid email address, but it will verify that it is entered in the appropriate manner. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to change our name and our ID, and then for the title here we'll change it to say please enter your email. I'm going to change my placeholder text to just say mail@url.com, and again this is going to be required. If we go ahead and save our page and look at it in the browser, you'll now see that some form elements are going to appear on the page. So you can see the get in touch, that's a result of the legend that we've placed on the page. So that's just going to help group this area of the form so that it'll have a specific value assigned to it. We're going to have the name, and you can see that in the name field, whoops, I switched my placeholder text here, so let's just switch that back. Alright, let's save that and refresh real quickly. So in the name field it now says last and first, and then we have the email, which is specifying the email. You can see when I hover over these areas I get the little tooltip that's going to pop up, and that is a result of the title tag. And it looks like I have those backwards as well, so let me just switch those. Alright, now this should make a little bit more sense. Okay, perfect. Alright, we'll continue on and build the rest of the form elements. These are the only two elements that are going to exist in my first ordered list. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create another field set which is going to contain the next area of the form that I want to be building. So for this second field set, I'm going to assign an ID of other, and this is where I'm going to be requesting other information. I'll assign a title attribute, and I'll type other information. Then I'm going to create a legend, and my legend is going to say other, and then I'll create another unordered list that is of course going to contain list items, and these items are going to have their own unique set of labels and input tags. I'll make my label This is going to contain my for tag. This is going to ask for a web address or a URL. We'll have the text say website, and then I'm going to make my input tag, and I'm going to set the type to URL. Once again, this is going to let the page know that I'm expecting a URL. The name needs to match the for attribute. We'll put some placeholder text on the page, and we'll go ahead and close that input tag. I'm just going to copy this list item right here. We're going to ask the user for their phone number. We're going to change the input type to tell, which is an HTML5 value for the type attribute, and for our placeholder we'll just say how we expect them to enter their phone number. Next, I'm going to make another list item. This list item is going to have a class assigned to it, and I'm going to assign the class of single line, and that's because I want this to appear on a single line. So this one, we're going to make some CSS eventually that's going to override the default CSS that we're going to be using for our form, and I'll explain that when we go to style the form. I'm going to set the input type to checkbox. We'll give this an ID of subscribe. We'll give it a name of subscribe, and I'm going to go ahead and assign this to be checked by default. So I'm going to type checked there, and I'm going to assign a value of yes. Then we'll close this input type, and then I'm going to put my label tag. So in this instance, I'm going to have my label appear after the element, and I'll show you how this looks once we jump into the browser. If we save now and we go look in the browser, you can see how I have my next field set. This is checked by default, and we want the checkbox to appear prior to the label. So the checkbox is going to appear, and then it's going to say subscribe to our mailing list. I'm going to add one more list item here, and this one is going to have the label appearing first, like we did before. The for attribute for this is going to be reference. The text that we want to display is going to say, how did you hear about us? And then I'm going to go ahead and create a select tag. The name is going to match the name of the for attribute. In this case, it's going to say reference. I'm going to give this an ID of reference as well. And then inside the select tag, I'm going to put option tags. The first option is just going to say choose. The next option tag is going to have the first set of options that I want. These will have values assigned to them so that when I would receive the form information, it would be able to identify what the person chose. I'll just copy this option field right here, and we'll paste this in. And the value for the next one is going to say Facebook. We'll change this to say Facebook. This one will say Twitter, and then we'll leave an option for other. And that is going to end this field set. If we save and look at this in the browser, you can now see that I have a pull-down menu where somebody can choose how they heard about us. So our form's coming along quite nicely. We're going to add one more field set area to our form. I'm going to go after the closing field set tag that I have right here, and we'll add one more field set. This one is going to have an ID of comments. We're going to give it a title of comments, and we'll create our legend tag. The legend will also say comments, and then inside the legend we'll have our ordered list, and it'll contain the list items. The first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a div that is going to exist within this list item. This is going to have a class, and we're going to call it group head. The text that I want to appear inside this div is going to say request type. Then we're going to close the div tag. Now, before the list item closes, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a nested ordered list. So I'm going to create another ordered list that is going to now be nested inside the previous one. This of course is going to have list items, and then we're going to go ahead and create our input types. Again, I want the input types to appear before the label tags, so I'm going to write them first. We're going to create some radio buttons here. They're going to have names of request type. This one's going to have a value of question, and it's going to have an ID of question item. I'll self-close my input type, and then I'm going to create my label tag. The label tag is going to have a for attribute, and the for attribute is going to match my ID. Then I'll have the text that I want to appear, which is going to say question, and then we'll close the list item. I'm going to copy this list item and we'll paste this in, and I'm going to make an input type. This one's going to be radio. It'll have a name of request type. The value for this one is going to be comment, and the ID is going to be comment item. The label is going to be for comment item, and the text will say comment. So I want to have two radio buttons where the user can check if they have a question or a comment that they want to include. Then I close the list, and then I close the ordered list item. Now I have the closing tag for the list item that was the parent, the one that contained the div called group head that wraps around everything. Let me get rid of this extra space here just to keep things organized. Now I'm going to create one more list item, and this list item is going to contain a comment field. So again, I'll go back to creating my label tag first. We'll assign the for attribute. We're going to give it a value of comments. Then we'll have the text of comments be displayed. Let's actually have it say your comments or questions. And then we'll make a text area field. I'm going to give it an ID. Let's give it an ID of inquiry. And then we're just going to close the text area box. We don't have to put anything inside of that. And then the final thing that we're going to want to add to our form is going to be a button. And this will contain the submit button. So I'm going to change the type to submit. And we're just going to put some text that says send right there. And then I already have my closing field set and my closing form tag. So if I save my page now, and I refresh, this is how the form currently looks. So we have our text input types, and we set some different HTML5 types so that we could utilize those. We made a checkbox, we made a pull-down menu, we made some radio buttons, we made a text box, and then we have the send button. This is the HTML that we need for our form. In the next few videos, we're going to be creating the CSS to style these so that they look the way that we want them to look. You can see right now that by itself this is somewhat responsive, but it doesn't really work that optimally. So we want to be able to control the CSS so that we can have exact control over how this actually works on the page. So we'll do that next.